Hi, grade 12 learners. My name is Remekio Singwenya, the History Coordinator in the province of Gauteng. Today, I would like to present to you a topic in paper 2, which is called the International Response to Apartheid under Civil Resistance. This topic is an essay section, which is covered in paper 2. Now, we are going to be looking at how the apartheid government was dismantled by the international community. This section is divided into two according to our CAPS policy document. We've got internal response to apartheid. We also have international response. But for our exam guidelines this year, our focus is on the international response. It's civil resistance in South Africa in the 1980s. Our focus in the period of the 1980s, how the international community impacted negatively on the apartheid government in the 1980s. Right, for every topic that we treat in the classroom, there are exam guidelines that we need to focus on. Now, the exam guidelines, as you have been having them from the beginning of the year, in paper 2, under this topic, we've got 6 examination guidelines that we must focus on. But we will also zoom in to the topic where the essay will come from or will emanate from. Now, under this topic, the exam guidelines looks at how the apartheid government tried to reform apartheid. Trying to reform apartheid is the first bullet. We will be looking as to how the international world responded to the way the apartheid government was now reformed in the 1980s. We will be looking at 2 movements that impacted negatively on the apartheid government under the international movement. One, we would be looking at the anti-apartheid movement in Britain, and then we also have the anti-apartheid movement in Ireland. These are the 2 movements that shook the world in compelling the whole governments around the world to try and assist in dismantling of apartheid in South Africa in the 1980s. We would be looking at the activities of the international movements, especially the British apartheid movement. Some of the activities of these movements were the boycotts, like the sports boycott, the cultural boycott, the academic boycott, consumer boycott, disinvestment, and sanctions. These are the activities that we will be focusing on that impacted negatively on the apartheid government. Then we will also, in our exam guideline, focus on how the frontline states assisted the international movement in dismantling the apartheid in South Africa. We will then focus on our next item. Now, as we have indicated in the exam guideline, in the 1980s, South Africa was under a tremendous pressure to look into how they should focus in dismantling apartheid, as well as the international community reacting to that. Now, how did the government reform apartheid? We learned that in 1980, P.W. Botha, who was in charge of the Nationalist Party government in the apartheid system, introduced new laws to reform apartheid, but not to do away with it. They tried to reform it. They introduced what we call the policy of total strategy. Now, total strategy was a policy which was introduced to bring more repression to the black nations particularly. How did this total strategy come into being? The tricameral system was introduced. Tri means three. The tricameral system represented only the white, the coloreds, and the Indians. Blacks were not included in this. So the so-called people classified as coloreds and Indians as well as whites were part of the tricameral system. But this excluded the majority of the African people in the form of blacks. Now, what does this mean? It means that the repression was not done away with. Apartheid was not dismantled. The structure of apartheid was even more repressive than it was before, during the time of P.W. Botha. And this ended up creating more alarming structures outside to say apartheid has to be totally removed or be dismantled. The structure of apartheid should be done away with because it was seen as crime against humanity. Now, the anti-apartheid movements now responded. This is how they responded to what is happening in the 1980s through the tricameral parliament as well as the total strategy. The response came in a form of, one, the anti-apartheid movement, which was established in Britain in the 1960s. And then we've got also the Irish apartheid anti-apartheid movement, which was introduced in 1964 by Professor Kader Asmal. And then we also have other anti-apartheid movements that were established in Western Europe and other parts of the countries. We will then also have a role player in a form of the frontline states, the states that were around the Southern Africa, which also took part in dismantling or in assisting the people of South Africa to get rid of the apartheid structure or the apartheid system. Now here we see a banner which was published in Ireland, which says, "Join the anti-apartheid movement." Now, these people were requested to come and assist in a movement in ensuring that apartheid in South Africa is done away with or is eradicated totally. Now, when you look at the pen, it has a hand of a person who is cuffed to apartheid, which is an indication that apartheid was seen as crime against humanity because it was a policy of oppression, especially to the black people. Now, these are the responses that we will be talking about throughout our lessons as to how did these movements contributed to the dismantling or to bring apartheid to its knees. As I have mentioned, Britain was one of the major roles, a role player who came up with what we call the anti-apartheid movement. This was a great movement which assisted the people in South Africa to get their freedom. Then we've got the African countries that contributed also in helping South Africa as well as the British anti-apartheid movement to work towards fighting against this apartheid policy and structure and bringing it to its utmost end. We also have Ireland, as I have mentioned, the Irish anti-apartheid movement in Ireland, which contributed also in ensuring that people in South Africa get their freedom. We also, the anti-apartheid movement did not only focus in Britain, but it also escalated and it moved to the rest of the world. So we will be then focusing on these role players. At the center, we have this British anti-apartheid movement. Now, we then have to say, what is this British anti-apartheid movement? We then have to understand, because this is the major movement and the organization that ensured that apartheid is dismantled in South Africa in the 1980s. Now, when we look at this, we say, throughout the world, there were countries that tried to come with measures to weaken or to topple apartheid. But it was the anti-apartheid movement in the United Kingdom that challenged the apartheid government in its seriousness. Now, the anti-apartheid movement developed a campaign that became the most powerful international solidarity movement. It was a solidarity movement, a movement that sympathized with the people of South Africa. The anti-apartheid movement was the major drive towards dismantling or deal with away with apartheid in the 1980s. Now we would be looking as to how did this anti-apartheid movement in England or in Britain influence other governments in other countries to work towards dismantling apartheid in South Africa. We will then be looking at what were the activities of this anti-apartheid movement in ensuring that apartheid is disrupted and it is finally brought to its knees. Now, the anti-apartheid movement activities, as I have indicated, this AAM developed the links with political parties to put pressure and to ensure that South Africa is destabilized. It is destabilized, and to ensure that every form of an apartheid structure is broken. How did they do this? They did this through trade. How can we affect the apartheid government through trade? Then they did this secondly with sanctions. They then used disinvestments and boycotts. These are the activities. That is our examination focus. The forms of apartheid or anti-apartheid movement response, various forms of response that we will be discussing through sanctions, boycotts, disinvestments, and trade. Now, the anti-apartheid movement persuaded individuals, it persuaded governments, it persuaded whatever form of action that would be taken necessary to achieve the isolation as well as the weakening of the apartheid structure. They formed this movement to ensure that all forms of government outside Africa, in the world, in the Western countries, to ensure that they become part of dismantling the apartheid structure on political means, on economic as well as social means. Now, this anti-apartheid movement's aim was to bring an awareness to all the British public, to make them aware on what the apartheid state is doing in South Africa. Now, what they have done is to inform not only the people in Britain, but the whole world. This campaign went right through to inform states that the apartheid government has to be totally eradicated or it has to be stopped. And how do we do this? Or how would they stop the apartheid government? Through the cutting off of oil supply. And also, South Africa must be cut off in obtaining arms. That means if they lose most of these things, trade, oil, arms, sanctions, disinvestments, and boycotts will make apartheid to realize that they need to change their policies. Now, as I said to you, there are various forms of boycotts that the anti-apartheid movement embarked on. And one of them is economic boycott. Now, under the economic boycott, we realized that the anti-apartheid movement, the first thing that they did was to pressurize their bank, which was Barclays Bank, to sell their investment in South Africa, which means they did not want South Africa to work with Barclays Bank again. And that would have an impact, a negative impact on South Africa's what we call financial rent. The British anti-apartheid movement also encouraged consumers to boycott all South African products. What does this mean? South Africans could no longer export any fruits or any wine. All their products were not allowed to be exported to Britain. That is one thing, which means South Africa could not trade with Britain on any form of products, such as fruits and wine. And in 1986, the United States Congress passed a law in which they banned all new investments and all loans to South Africa. South Africa no longer had any form of investment, any form of loans, any form of import, and any form of export. What does that mean? It means now South Africa was slowly being isolated and its structure was getting weaker and weaker. South African Airways, for an example, was no longer allowed to land in the US airports, which means the planes in South Africa could no longer travel to America. Whatever they are bringing, whether it's food, whether it's products, whether it's a form of trade, or whether in a form of import or export, South Africa was then isolated from America in getting in or in getting out or in bringing in their goods or in exporting their goods. Now, large corporations such as the General Electric, a corporation are the big companies. Big companies such as the General Electric, big companies such as the International Business Machines, big companies such as General Motors, big companies such as the Coca-Cola, big companies such as the Mobil, a petroleum industry which today is called Engine, big products such as Kodak, which is a film industry that has to introduce cameras and filming. They closed their operations in South Africa. That is under the economic boycott. These companies decided no longer to work with South Africa. They pulled their investments and they pulled their companies, which means this would lead to loss of jobs. This would lead to economic downfall, and the rand will lose its value should these companies withdraw their support to South Africa. Now, this was not the only removal. The Chase Manhattan Bank, a very large corporation, financial institution, decided to cut ties, decided to remove their relationship and ended their relationship with South Africa. And once the bank removed its resources, the country was now in a financial crisis. South Africa's value of the rand dropped by 35%. Now, this is the impact that the economic boycott had on South Africa under the leadership of the anti-apartheid movement. The next boycott is called the consumer boycott. Now, South Africa experienced a recession in the 1980s. The economy has gone down. South Africa is no longer allowed to import or to export their goods. A number of people lost their jobs. The government could not sort of like bring stability in the country because now groups, the anti-apartheid groups requested the public to boycott all South African products. Now, all South African products could no longer be exported. And that means then South Africa could not gain anything from the international world. The Irish workers, as I talked about, the Irish anti-apartheid movement, refused to handle any goods that come from South Africa. So then that means they no longer want anything that has to do with South Africa in terms of their products. Imports of raw material, such as coal, iron, steel from South Africa were banned, which means the international world refused to accept any coal, any iron, any steel that comes from South Africa. Then South Africa was slowly getting weaker and weaker in terms of policy around economy, around culture, around products, around imports, and around exports. Now, many British citizens refused to buy goods that were produced in South Africa. Now, this was very, very, very bad in the apartheid structure. If the country can no longer export their goods, if the country can no longer import their goods, and the country is faced with a recession, it simply says to you that country can no longer sustain itself because the financial rent has dropped, there's no import, there's no export, and countries have withdrawn their corporations or their companies, leading to what we call economic slump in the country or economic downfall. Now, there's another form of boycott that took place in a form of what we call sports boycott. Now, under sports boycott, we see that there was a group that was called the Non-Racial Olympic Committee. The Non-Racial Olympic Committee took the lead to isolate South Africa from international sports. In the 1980s, South Africa was banned from participating into the sporting codes international. South Africa was suspended by a body called FIFA and all African football confederations. South Africa could no longer participate in CAF, it could no longer participate in FIFA and all other soccer sporting codes. International Cricket Council, which was called the ICC, it also suspended all their tours to South Africa. The International Cricket Council no longer wanted to visit South Africa, which means South Africa was also suspended or was banned from participating in international cricket. The International Rugby Federation suspended all their rugby contacts with South Africa. In all forms of sporting codes, South Africa was excluded, or South Africa was isolated. Now, not only politically or economically, also socially in terms of sports. We see in 1981, the New Zealand protested against the Springbok tour. The group of white Springbok players went to visit to New Zealand to go and compete. They were not accepted to come and participate with New Zealand. And by the late 1980s, South Africa was banned from most of the sporting codes. About 90% of the sporting codes, South Africa could not perform. South Africa could not weigh itself or compete with the other parts of the world. And therefore, the government had to look into this because South Africa cannot weigh itself or measure itself against the world in terms of sports or sporting competitions. South Africa was no longer allowed to also take part in the Olympics, international sports and Olympics in the 1980s. Now we go to another point, which is the cultural boycott. Now, what was the cultural boycott? In the cultural boycott, we've got what we call an equity group. An equity group was a group that was established in England that looked into banning all its programs from being screened in SABC. Now, SABC could no longer access all cultural programs that took place in the world or internationally. The members of the equity group were not allowed to travel to South Africa to tour and promote culture and ethnicity in the international world. So the Freedom Concert in London called an end to apartheid. There was a Freedom Concert that called for an end to apartheid. They say, if the apartheid does not come to an end, we will not participate in supporting them. Artists against apartheid that was formed by Dalit Tambo and Gerrit Rimas. They ensured that apartheid is a crime against humanity. We will not support it. Artists from abroad refused to visit South Africa to come and perform. Artists from South Africa were not allowed to go and perform abroad. Our music was not promoted outside South Africa. And we did not also receive some of the international music in order to use it as a form of entertainment from the other parts of the world until apartheid was done away with. British actors, the Actors Union, which was called Equity, forbid the use of television programs in South Africa involving its members. The Union Actors Movement refused to come and act and do performances in South Africa because of the apartheid structure. So this was one of the major boycott that affected South Africa on issues of sports and on issues of culture. In 1985, the USA's artists came together to say, we will not perform in South Africa. They refuse. The United States artists refused to come and perform in South Africa in 1985. Now, another form of protest was disinvestment. Now, the term disinvestment is an opposite of investment. Then what happened in South Africa in the 1980s under this activity of the anti-apartheid movement? Disinvestment took charge as a result of the 1976 Soweto uprising, as well as the death of Steve Biko. The two events made the world to see that apartheid should be totally dismantled. In any other form, we need to do away or dismantle the apartheid structure and the apartheid state. Sweden was the first industrial country to disinvest in South Africa, to disinvest and remove their products. By 1984, foreign investment dropped by 30% in South Africa, a huge percentage. If you lose such foreign investment, there's no means of survival. By 1980, Britain already disinvested from Simon's Town, which means Britain has now ensured that all its investment and all the goods that they exported to South Africa were withdrawn. General Motors and Barclays Bank pulled out. That's another form of disinvestment. General Motors was a motor industry that produced a number of cars in South Africa. That company withdrew its investment, as well as the Barclays Bank, as we said, under the economic boycott. In the 1980s, South Africa's economy started struggling. The economy started struggling as investors left the country. As investors left the country, a number of people were unemployed, and there was so much chaos and disorder from internal pressure as well as the external pressure. The rand in South Africa was devalued. It means the rand lost its value. It was devalued. Between 1985 and 1990, over 200 USA companies pulled out of South Africa. So that is an indication that the British anti-apartheid movement meant business in ensuring that the apartheid government is totally eradicated. The sanctions. In 1980, the Sullivan Principles workers of all USA companies should be treated equally. That formed the basis for this disinvestment campaign. This Sullivan Principle ensured that if people are not treated equally in any part of the world, then we cannot participate in such countries or in such areas where inequality is not addressed. Student protests in the 1980s, they also contributed in ensuring that South Africa is losing trading from USA. In 1982, the United Nations condemned the apartheid government, and they called for total sanctions. Now, when the United Nations, the world body, says South Africa must be sanctioned totally, that means business. South Africa had no choice, but they had to relook into their apartheid policies or apartheid legislation. As I said in the economic boycott, the US Bank, the Manhattan, was also contributed into removing their ties with South Africa. Johannesburg Stock Exchange was closed for a period of 4 days after the Manhattan withdrew their support. The value of the rand, as I said, it dropped from 54 to 34 cents to the dollar. That simply says the apartheid government was brought into its knees in terms of their financial standing in the country. In 1985, the European Economic Community banned new investments in South Africa. Now, the European Economic Community says no support must be provided to South African government. They banned their new investments. So South Africa could not get any form of investment from the European community. International banks also lost confidence in South Africa's economy. Therefore, South Africa's financial standing was in tatters, or it was in a chaotic condition. In 1987, because it was not only the finance, but the military as well, in 1987, Israel voted not to extend any existing defense contracts with South Africa, which means Israel stopped trading arms with South Africa because of the apartheid system and because of the influence of the British anti-apartheid movement. So South Africa could no longer have a relation in getting arms from Israel. In 1988, the British and the American companies withdraw from South Africa, which means by 1988, there was no company that was left to support South Africa from the international community. Now, there was another campaign by the British anti-apartheid movement. The campaign was called Free Mandela Campaign. The British anti-apartheid movement promoted that Mandela must be released, he must be freed by this apartheid government. They promoted and they also launched a Free Mandela campaign in a film that was introduced when Mandela was 70 years old. They celebrated his birthday. In that celebration, that's when they preached or promoted the idea that Mandela should be released. That is called the Free Mandela Campaign. This concert was met with a huge success. This concert became successful in the UK and it was spread worldwide. When these things were happening in the 90s, F.W. de Klerk announced the unbanning of the Liberation Organization. And on the 2nd of February, 1990, on the 11th of February, 1990, Mandela walked out of prison because of the influence and the pressure that was placed in by the international movement, the anti-apartheid movement. Now, these were not the only activities that participated in dismantling the apartheid structure. There was also the role of the Defense Fund, the International Defense Fund. What was this International Defense Fund? This was a fund that was organized by the international world to support the apartheid activists in South Africa, those who were undergoing trials, those who were undergoing court cases in South Africa were assisted by the funds of the International Defense. The fund was paid or paid the legal cost of most of the anti-apartheid trialists. And for more than 25 years, this company has been supporting, or this structure has been supporting the apartheid activists to be freed and to totally fight against the apartheid legislations or apartheid laws. Now, the anti-apartheid movement was not the only structure or the movement that participated in dismantling or in eradicating forms of apartheid. But the frontline states also, the states in the Southern Africa, participated in ensuring that South Africa's apartheid system can no longer be supported or can no longer be tolerated. As part of the total strategy, P.W. Botha tried to form a relationship with the South African states to try and win them to his side. But what happened? The only parts or countries in the states that participated were the homelands. Only the homelands and Malawi participated in P.W. Botha's Constellation of Friendship. Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, Angola, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe refused to be part of Botha's alliance, which means they did not want to continue to relate with South Africa until apartheid is eradicated or apartheid is done with. The Organization of African Unity, which was established in 1963, did not recognize the apartheid government. The Organization of African Unity only recognized the ANC as well as the PAC, the opposition parties to the apartheid government, an indication that the apartheid structure was not even recognized by an African body, which was established in 1963. And what happened after it was recognized, after the ANC and the PAC were recognized? They were not only recognized, but the ANC as well as the PAC were allowed to have offices in the African countries to operate, to do their things in there. The apartheid government reacted by the policy of what we call destabilization of cross borders. Now, the apartheid government realized that the ANC, the PAC, and all the activists of the opposition were getting assisted by the African countries in the south. They were opening offices and they were doing their operations and they got a lot of support. Then, how did Botha and his government try to destabilize them? They closed the borders to check everyone who crossed over so that they prevent all the activists who go out of South Africa to go and mobilize or to prepare against the apartheid government. So they tried to dismantle that. But they did not succeed because the MK, Umkhonto weSizwe, operated from the neighboring countries. They organized themselves by being assisted by countries such as Mozambique, Tanzania, Zambia, and Angola. That is an indication that these frontline states were also totally against the apartheid system. They could no longer befriend this apartheid government. They also wanted apartheid to be eradicated. Now, the frontline states also pressurized the South African or Southern African Development Coordination Committee, the SADCC, to promote their own development and not to be part of South Africa's economy. The SADCC established a unit that would say, we are not part of South Africa. We are not part of South Africa. The formation of SADCC added to the isolation of South Africa from the international community. The anti-apartheid movement was not the only movement that contributed a lot in the dismantling of apartheid, but other structures in the southern states of Africa also contributed in removing their relationship, economic relationship, political relationship, and otherwise. Then South Africa had no option but to relook into how they should work towards ending the apartheid structure. The SADCC, that is the Southern African Development Coordination Conference, also bore fruits when South Africa held its first non-racial democratic election, which means it's not only the British anti-apartheid movement that saw success when South Africa started having a new democratic election in 1994. But the frontline states, it was not only the internal pressures from the trade unions, from the PAC, from the ANC, and all other opposition parties to dismantle apartheid, but there were also international pressures, which we need to understand how they then looked into this. Now, South Africa's economy was faced with international sanctions, disinvestment, and boycotts. The collapse of the gold price in 1981 led to South Africa experiencing an economic recession. And the economic growth fell from 8% to 4% in 1981. From 8 to 4, an indication that the collapse had an impact on the government. And this led to a rise of inflation. It led to unemployment, especially the black communities in South Africa. And this also led to the value of the rand that depreciated, and the imports and the exports that were not, or were very much expensive, and South Africa could not manage or afford such trials. Then it says here, the beginning of the end. It means this was the start of the end of apartheid, or the beginning of the end of apartheid. In this case, then, we therefore say by the end of 1986, South Africa was cut off totally from the international capital. In addition to this, the internal resistance that took place in the 1980s through COSATU, the trade unions, through NUM, through UTM, through the PAC, through the ANC, also pressurized South Africa to change its legislation policies of repression or of oppressing the other race or the other nation. Then we can thus say various forms of international protest led to the collapse of South Africa's economy. And the apartheid government had no option but to rethink its policies and to begin negotiations with the ANC and the other liberation organizations. I hope you understood what I have been trying to highlight to you. Reflecting back to what I have just said to you, this topic on the international response to apartheid is an essay section. As an essay section, you need to prepare the main bullet in the examination guideline, which is the various forms of protest that the anti-apartheid government initiated in order to dismantle or in order to, the British anti-apartheid movement initiated to dismantle the apartheid structure. When we look at those boycotts and the sanctions, that's where you need to prepare yourselves, because the focus on the examination paper looks into various forms of protest that impacted negatively on the apartheid structure through the means of the British anti-apartheid movement. With this, my learners, I say to you, for any questions and for any clarity around this topic, you need to ask, and then you will be given the clarity as to how to prepare for an examination around this topic. I would wish that as you are at home, keep that distance, stay healthy, stay focused, take note of your books. Remember, it's about your future. You need to stand up and read. You need to stand up and study. If you have an opportunity to ask from your educators as you are studying through WhatsApp or any form of social media, you are at liberty to ask. This broadcast also will be on YouTube, wherein you will be given the email address of myself and all those who are presenting the subject so that you can ask of any question should you need clarity. Thank you so much. Keep safe, keep studying, stay home, and be healthy.